Hi everyone. So I'm going to share a small bit of analysis with you that I found out by researching on the internet, and this is basically what I believe that it's going to be my prediction for the future as we grow together. So the bottom line is that by 2070, I believe that China will overtake USA, and that might happen around 2061. India will not be able to overtake China, but it might until 2082. So my prediction is that US might fall to the third position by 2070. Second will be India, and first will be China. This is a very this scenario analysis is a very optimistic and a pessimistic scenario analysis that I've done. So, if we consider the optimistic scenario analysis where there is a higher possibility of Indian growth, then India overtakes China by 2065 and China still overtakes US by 2061. So, finally, India might also become the best by in this century. We never know. I mean, we have to consider the advantages as well of what we are seeing of India vis-a-vis China in this regard. So, India has the potential of a demographic dividend. It has a young growing workforce, and it is in a very economic catch-up phase where it has a very structural growth potential through its targeted investments in the projects that it is basically currently handling, and it is doing a very structural reform, taking a very reformed path with its making India progress and with its ease of doing business and all its regulations. But what China has an advantage is that China basically has a substantial head start over India. Now it has a very solid infrastructure base also, and it is an export economy. So we have to keep these three things in mind. However, the major constraints of China as compared to India is that China has an aging population, and basically it is into a middle income trap phase which it might be able to get out, but there is a very 30-70% chance of it. See, the important caveats which I am taking in this analysis is that these projections are using real purchasing power. So I have researched on the basis of real purchasing power and not on the basis of nominal purchasing power, because obviously nominal values will be much higher. And the assumption sensitivity is that small changes in growth rate assumptions can also lead to massive alterations in terms of the numbers if you might tally with it in the future or not. And there are structural factors as well, major economic disruptions. We have seen COVID, we have seen any technological breakthrough like DeepSeek, any policy change which happens, it could alter these trajectories. So the pillars in which I compare China and India on in this analysis are pillared on three phases. So the first phase which I have analyzed is the transition to a high middle income developed economy status. Now China's advanced transition challenge is that it is already deep inside the high middle income status. So it is very easy for them to get out of that status and become a developed nation. So, but this transition is the hardest phase because it has to shift from a very quantitative approach to a very qualitative approach. It has to emphasize on innovation. It has to emphasize on productivity. It has to emphasize on service sophistication, which they don't. They are a very low cost intensive country, which they also pressurize workforce to work for a slog for long hours and produce as much quantity as possible with the less people consuming it. So they have to export it abroad, and its aging demographics is creating this urgency of a complete transition which it might not happen with India. We see an emerging economic advantage. Now it is a very its current status is that it is a lower middle income group, in the lower middle income range with room for rapid catch up. Its emerging economic transition is very achievable. It has the basic requirements, basic industrialization, infrastructural and service development. We have recently also seen how World Bank invested in Uttar Pradesh and how we are seeing the growth in terms of RBI giving dividends to central government has also improved our stature. then we also understand that the major factor which basically hinges upon this game is that China faces a very innovation imperative challenge. So basically, what I believe is that India benefits from its follower advantage, but China has a very innovation imperative challenge because it might grow as a technological leader sooner or later, but its ability to grow with in terms of its resources that it uses, that is very complicated because it might suggest that adapting proven technologies and development models from a lower base to a higher growth potential is okay, but to optimize it is something which China hasn't been able to do it as much as US has been able to do it. And with a simple example I can give is of how they use the LLM model of Grok in US vis-a-vis DeepSeek in China. Many are not even using DeepSeek nowadays because its productivity or its produced results are not that capable of being so intelligent as compared to Grok. So US is as an advantage is basically growing in terms of its selective intelligentsia that it uses in its technological base. So that is why it is remaining as probably it may remain supreme for many days to come. Second, which I analyzed, is on the basis of middle income trap avoidance. Now, I believe that has a very high risk position because its trap probability, according to me, is that it might have a 30% chance of getting stuck and 70% chance of avoiding it. The critical vulnerabilities which I think are hitting China are that it has a rising labor costs, it has a debt overhang from an infrastructure boom that limits any productive investments, and it has technological restrictions that hampers productivity gains. As you may know that China basically whatever it uses, it censors it a lot, and also it basically uses it for its military applications. So its civil military apparatus status is something which is restricting entrepreneurial growth. So that is one thing, and also their real estate bubble is misallocating their capital. So, and India's favorable position is that it has a service-led growth model which is less vulnerable to a manufacturing trap. So it still is also 15 to 20 years away from preparing itself. It is learning the lessons of what China has been doing so it can grow itself stronger. And third is that it has a demographic dividend which provides continued labor force expansion and lower wage base. Maintaining its competitiveness is something which India basically has a very strong and precision wise advantage over China. Well, I believe that China is in a danger zone, but it can get out. But India is in a forward zone, so India is looking at China, and if China reacts to anything, how they get out of it through its Belt and Road Initiative, through its massive domestic market, through its technological upgrades or whatever, India can learn from it and India can adapt to it so that India doesn't enter that zone at the first instance. And the major development model analysis that I have made is the aging population one. So China has a demographic crisis, which I believe so, and that is what is basically dragging them to a negative annual GDP growth rate, in my opinion. One of the major criteria behind it. Otherwise, there is no problem for China because China's constraints are that it is making it immigration difficult for any ethnically homogeneous society. We see how they have been torturing their own people. Their one-child policy legacy creates very unprecedented aging speed. Their pension and healthcare system also basically unprepares is an unprepared force for the and it burdens a lot, and it must achieve productivity gains of at least 2 to 3% annually to maintain its growth rate. India has a demographic dividend. Now, India's working age population growth, as you may know, has a 16.7% appreciation by 2050. It is it is a very stable dependency, only modest increase from let's say 48 to 52 dependents per 100 workers, and it has a economic boost as well. So India is a rising economy, so it is giving it a very solid boost to it through its annual GDP growth advantage. So I believe that India's young population will entail a very labor-intensive manufacturing to capture the export markets as China ages. Infrastructural building will be also done by India's young workers, so they will build a very solid infrastructural base. Domestic consumption will grow from an expanding middle class because we are a very expanding middle class, and we will be technologically adopting the digital native generation. So these are the analysis that I have made, and in terms of the overall assessment that I see is that China is probably having a 10 to 15 years head start, and it may be eroded by structural challenges that is bound to happen. India's favorable conditions could enable a faster convergence than historical patterns that suggest, and 2030s will especially be very critical because China's success or failure in transition will determine long-term competitiveness, and India's consistent growth trajectory could make it more reliable development story by 2040. So I believe China currently leads in a long-term development race. Let's not make decisions faster than anything better. And I believe that with the potential to achieve sustained high growth, China faces increasingly difficult transition challenges. So these were my analysis, short snippets that I have made on my opinion of how we look at the tripolar US, India, China by 2070. So overall picture, if I may say so, by 2050, India may be closing the gap. India will become a developed nation. Its HDI may increase by 2034. That's bound to happen. And it will narrow the gap between China's second position and itself in third position. And then US might take a dip because of its own issues with how it manages its own resources, and we might see a very optimistic growth of India. So India is in a very optimistic path. Thank you very much.